UTOKing with Gregg. Welcome back. Is Bruce Alderman, one of my favorite people, is back on the show, and he has been willing to be subjected to the special iQuad edition. Hey, welcome, Bruce. How you doing?
Thank you, Gregg. Yeah, happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, man. So some of you may know that we walked John Vervaeke through part one of this sort of matrix, and now I want to I've adjusted a little. I dove into this thing. My goal, as I told Bruce right before we hit record, is to gain his depth and wisdom and perspective on this thing. I think there's some real value here, but I'm very deep into it and I'm not really sure what to make of it. So I'm going to subject Bruce to the associations and see how he metabolizes them and what he spits back.
Okay. All on one cup of coffee. I'll do my best.
Right. Well, we'll break it up. You know, this is actually, so just a background. All right. So I'm going to give a little bit of background and then. So for me, what we're going to then explore then is the iQuad coin. You know, people, if you're watching this thing, it's this thing. I mailed Bruce one, so you should have one. And it's one of the three sort of real pieces of our architecture of ideas that UTOK really has taken shape around. And the relationship between the three ideas is key. We'll be dialoguing some about that, but fundamentally the three ideas are the coin, which is about the individual subjective experience of being. So me as Gregg and Bruce as Bruce as phenomenological agents in the world as human persons. And we'll talk about what that is. So it's a placeholder for that. And then the tree is a frame for scientific ontology, a natural behavioral science ontology that affords a particular third-person empirical way of describing the world. And my argument is that when we built physics through modern science, we never really figured out a way to get the third-person physical view and the first-person phenomenological view in proper right relation. And much of UTOK is about that, and much of what the coin and tree are about that. And then ultimately, it's getting right relationship to that through phenomenological, physical isness, and then fundamentally down the road, but I won't be talking too much about that this time, to then orient ultimately toward wisdom. So the vision for UTOK is a clear articulation from 3 points: a science point, a subjective phenomenological point, and ultimately a collective wisdom point, to then enter into, from those various sort of objectivity, subjectivity, intersubjectivity frames of reference, and then have a consilient, coherent, intelligible, plausible frame of reference. That's the goal.
Sounds good.
So, okay. So I'm going to do, so the iQuad editions require PowerPoint, so they are visual. So I'm going to share my screen real fast and just give you, I'm going to start, I didn't send you actually this part, I built this up just to, I'm going to start with just some of the key pieces that set the background, then we'll drop into the first part, which I went over with John. Okay.
While you're pulling that up, are you familiar with William Desmond?
I've heard of William Desmond, but no, what's helped me with that?
He's a theologian, but also a philosopher. His theology is really deep enough that it can be, read as philosophy, regardless of your theological beliefs. And he talks about being from a number of different perspectives. But one of the fundamental ones, which I've appreciated for the play, is he calls it the idiocy of being. But, non-philosophically, you might take it one way, but philosophically, he is looking at that idiographic and that singularity and the uniqueness of each being in unfolding the dimensions of human living. So
great.
That's where he starts, is the idiocy of being.
Perfect. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've come to appreciate, which I always intuited, but I don't know that I appreciated all the layers of it, especially until recently. It's just the recognition of how inadequate the language game of science is for the idiographic subjective. I always knew that it was difficult at the level of the subjective, how do you do science of consciousness? And I always knew it was about general nomenclatic rather than idiographic. But if you actually put idiographic and subjective together, okay, which is, of course, our normal position of being in the world as idiots, Right. But anyway, that's our normal position of being in the world, trying to get along as talking apes in our own unique, epistemological portal. Science is unbelievably bad at that position. I mean, this language game is fundamentally blind to that. And then you get philosophers, modernist philosophers, with the epiphenomenological argument. Oh, hey, it's really just an idea that we see things and feel things. That's really just the brain doing that and all of that. The stupidity of that argument, of course, is that obviously you and I in this conversation, our subjectivities are mediating and moderating everything that we're doing. So if I ask you, hey, how you're doing? I tell you, hey, Bruce, I've had some back pain that scared me. Well, that's not my brain talking to your brain. That's my subjectivity talking to your subjectivity. Right. The idea that that's epiphenomenal. You have to interpret my words. You don't interpret my brain. So it's like, you don't know what my brain looks like, and I don't know what your brain looks like. So our whole embodied way of being is what everyone else responds. So because so when you think behaviorally, the world becomes much more apparent that you don't reduce it to atoms. Anyway, the bottom line is that we clearly, in my estimation or my philosophy of science, we can appreciate the enormous power of a modern scientific view, but we absolutely need to appreciate that it has design blind spots. That's what affords it much of its power, is because it fundamentally moves you out from your subjective idiosyncratic bias view. But at the same time, if it does that by design, we can't then go ahead and say, oh, well, because we build in the idea that it can't speak to this, then this must not matter. It's like, no, that is not what follows. What we need then is a placeholder and a proper relation between idiographic subjectivity and objectivity, at least as revealed and positioned by the epistemology of modern empirical natural science. And it is that's the relation. And I argue with the Enlightenment gap, we just have not figured out clearly the proper descriptive metaphysical systems and frameworks that afford us the synergy between those. That's mind-body problem and all the craziness about what is consciousness and everything else. So that's the context for what this is basically it's designed to address a particular problem. And the iQuad coin, fundamentally the iQuad side of the coin is a symbol that then affords a identity connection between the individual as a speaking, feeling, narrating self-ego in the world, unique, idiosyncratic, and then to create an identity matrix so that they can see themselves in the world, and then bridge that to third-person empirical science ultimately, and also bridge it to at least one wisdom tradition, the garden, and because it's an argument that's lots of different potential paths to wisdom, but the garden then affords a particular path to wisdom. And then that would say, hey, there's really the first opportunity for a physics, phenomenology, subjectivity, wisdom frame that is deep into physical science as you can get, is clear about modern psychological natural sciences, and then bridges to reasonable wisdom, theological, reflective frames. So that's the basic deal. To understand the ultimate package, and like I said, we're not going to get all this, but you've already been subjected to some of this. I use that in multiple meanings. But and I actually, as I walked you through that time, I hadn't walked it through in a while. I walked Bruce, I don't know, what was it, 6 months ago or whatever. I tried to walk you through what's called the iQuad path. I realized even when I was doing that, it was a little clunky. I built the iQuad path in 2017. It's a thing called the iQuad path, and I was walking you through that. And the whole matrix of understanding cuts back and requires some basic frames. So 4 different pieces that are key, and we'll be focused on this first one today, but it's important to know the others as we dive into that. So the first frame that's crucial is to know iQuad, and it means 2 things, or create an adjacency between them, and I'll be explaining that today. One is a simple meaning of math in mathematics, which is I as the imaginary number. And so you have to have a little knowledge of what I is as an imaginary number, square root of -1. Square root of the -1 is raised to the 4th power, that equals 1. Okay, so it's that relation, I quad as I to the 4th, which also equals 1. And then it's that relation gets fused with sort of the metaphysics of adjacency or whatever, the framework of association, a prepositional looping with what I'll call the identity function. So that's the first frame. And that's what I'll be talking mostly with you about today. But it is crucial to understand the root of this because we're sort of like going backwards in time, meaning that we're starting with where it is and then going back to its origins, but it's important to know the origins. The origins of this frame date back to 2001. Okay, that's where the origins are. To understand some of the deep origins, you need some basic background on what's called the Euler Identity. It's a mathematical equation called the Euler Identity. I'm not going to be explaining the Euler Identity. I just am tagging it here to say there is ultimately a deep connection with the Euler Identity, which is a special case of the Euler Formula. Okay. And no, there's not going to be any tests about what these are and how to apply them. But there is a deep ultimate connection between this argument and the iQuad and human identity function, the Euler Identity and Euler Formula. And the reason is because in 2001, the history of this whole idea stems to 2001 when I stumbled across what I originally called the Henricus equivalency. Okay. The Henricus equivalency is this weird formula that says 2 pi I f equals 1. Okay. So it's those four things. There's an identity function, the Euler identity, Euler formula, and the equivalency. And it's the interrelationship at the deep end that affords the matrix that I'm trying to help people see ultimately. I think you're muted there if you want to.
I apologize. Yeah, please continue.
Okay.
To do. Yeah.
Oh, sure. All right. Okay. Okay. With this frame, okay, what I'm attempting to do is I'm building a metaphysical system, okay, meaning the set of concepts and categories that afford an opportunity for us to have first person and third person empiricism. Third person empiricism defined in relationship to the epistemology of modern natural science. First person empiricism defined in relationship to an everyday position of a human person. And then create a structure that affords a logos, a logical picture of the world, which then can be employed to achieve right relationship between what is and what ought to be. That's the overall, and that becomes the iQuad path to wisdom energy, is the energy of what is and the wisdom of what ought to be in getting one's subjective frame in proper relationship to that. So that's the goal of this thing that I'm after. Okay. And part of I won't get into this, but just on the center of the tree of life is that yellow flower. Okay. The yellow flower is the me flower, and that stands for metaphysical empiricism. And the big me in the center is an overarching large-scale system of justification that organizes data, like science would be a big me. And the little me's are individuals that have belief, concepts, categories, their own metaphysical systems, and their own first-person experience of being in the world. And so the me flower is about, hey, can we build a metaphysical system that affords a proper bridging between first-person phenomenology and each individual idiosyncratic and third-person scientific ontology, and any other number of cases. So it's that network and matrix that I'm definitely after.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I relate the adjacency of the metaphysics and empiricism to the overall concern with post-metaphysics from,
Totally.
Modern and postmodern project forward, and really is post-metaphysical in that it will always try to interrelate the metaphysical frame with empirical, grounding, and also have a flexibility that it can be metametaphysical in a way that it could explore multiple metaphysical framings for their fitness with the empirical findings.
Totally. Yeah, that's great. And indeed, if there's a diagram that I've seen that's close to what I'm meaning here, it's related to the diagram you shared with me, the ontology, epistemology, ontic, epistemic, yin yang. I can't recall exactly who it was that but you showed me that yin-yang representation, and that's got a lot of deep overlap in terms of just mapping concepts. In fact, I would say sort of ontic ontology, epistemic epistemology would fall right under metaphysics, and that interacting relationship between known and real versus knower and how we know processes is great. So you and I share that very similar, I think, connection.
Great. Yeah, and for the record, that's Joel Morrison who came up with that.
Thank you. Great. Okay. So the first thing then is just getting back to the iQuad, and just for people who are listening so that they know what it is and if it's a review. One of the things then of the iQuad is I to the fourth, and I to the fourth is a symbol for the complex unit circle. A complex unit circle is a my son's a math major. He just took a class in complex numbers, okay? And this is the first thing you learn in complex numbers, which is the complex number plane. The complex number plane is the idea that you have a real number plane, so 1, 2, 3 on the positive, and then the negative 1, 2, 3 real numbers, and then orthogonally on the y-axis you have I, 1i, 2i, 3i, and then negative I, negative 1, 2, 3i. Okay, so the complex number plane is then considered a real by imaginary plane with the axes defined as such. Complex numbers are when you have a real number plus an imaginary number. So if you had 3 plus 2i, that would be a place on the complex plane. A useful geographic frame on understanding this complex number plane is the unit circle or complex unit circle. A standard unit circle just has a radius of 1. Complex unit circle is when you have this complex plane axis of real by imaginary. And then the unit circle is going around. If you say start at I, if you multiply I, which is the square root of negative 1 times itself, by definition, I squared then is negative 1. And then if you multiply I to that, you get negative I. And then if you multiply to the fourth, you get 1. And that creates the whole looping circle. And the iQuad is at a mathematical grid level, the iQuad represents this equivalency, and it represents the unit circle on the complex plane. At the level of adjacency, of concepts of adjacency, it's interesting that it affords us in a mathematical sense, at least, and there are big debates about the way to think about these terms, but notice that we now have at our disposal on this is sort of a real, imaginary, and complex sort of plane to play around with. And by playing around with that, if we're doing it in relationship to subjectivity, you can say, hey, I've got my imagined world. There's the real world out there. There's some sort of interplay between them at some know or known relation. There are a lot of different ways that you can loosely play with that by association. But that's some of the things that the iQuad does, is it affords loose associations and then to create networks of understanding. And that's one of the things I think is really exciting about it. It's also complicated because when to apply those networks, it's not always easy and what they mean. But this is just a frame on what the iQuad symbolizes. The second thing is the shape of the coin. And the shape of the coin is in H, which stands for the human. And then if you rotate the coin, this rotation, you turn it on its side, and that becomes I, and then that's identity. So, and this is the human identity function or the human identification matrix. If you listen to John Vervaeke, he gives a great articulation of sort of identification. The concept of identification, like if we put it in just sort of embodied ways of being, is that we are constantly building models of ourselves and the world and engaged in really an identification matrix of ourselves, who we are. I'm Gregg. What the world is, this is a desk. This is a chair. This chair is for sitting. So I immediately create an identification matrix of what entities are and what they afford me, what I am and what my role is. So I am here to share with you this iQuad coin. You're here to listen and serve as a dialogos interlocutor partner. and we are here to try to explore this. So that creates the identification matrix. We are doing this subconsciously all the time. That's in fact what we're doing, is we're building models of self and world implicitly, and then acting on those models. If you take a basic brain processing view, we're trying to reduce surprise. So we're creating models. We're trying to create identification of our models with the world, how we act with them. When we get surprised, we update our models. And so what this basically says is, hey, here's the identity, here you are, and then here is the identification matrix. And that's what it represents. And that should be as a starting point, that should be pretty consistent with people. Oh yeah, I can see that I have a model of me. I see the world. I'm mapping the self-world relation.
Have you explored any intersections of this with something like Lacan's Borromean knot, with the interplay of the real and the imaginary and symbolic?
Only a little bit. Cadell Last is on the intellectual deep web, and his work and Bard's work pointed me in that direction. I got some into that, saw a couple of videos on Lacan, and have that as flagged as something I should do a deep dive in. It's interesting now, in fact, actually I'll pause here because I want to share this with you also, is because I am in over the last 5 years, the transition into UTOK and the garden has opened me up into a wide variety of different perspectives, whereas before I think I was more narrowly critical of a lot of perspectives. When I first encountered Lacan, I was like, who can read this shit?
Exactly.
And I was like, more psychoanalytic psychobabble, hell. That I realize that's definitely premature relative to his level of sophistication. Another exact similar thing, this is why I stopped and shared it with you, is have you read A Greater Psychology, the work of Sri Aurobindo, by any chance? That's put together by a clinical psychologist who followed his work, but it basically, it chronicles Sri Aurobindo's approach to psychology, which I would imagine you have some familiarity with, given that he was the yogi who really inspired lots of Wilber's work.
Yes, it's been a lot of years since I looked at that book, but I read it maybe 15 years ago or something like that. It's probably something I should go back to and look at again.
Well, it's really actually I was really taken aback by reading it this time. I got into it, read it in a couple of days. So 10 years ago, when I get it, I just happened upon it. I knew that Wilber was interested in Sri Aurobindo. I'd come back around to Wilber and been okay, but I opened up the book and it's just sort of like, I can't do anything with it. It's so abstract. And then the terminology of, there's what's called supermind and overmind that he's trying to reach in this regard. When I first encountered that, and I read through 30 pages, whatever, put it away. This time I read it, it's like, oh my God, I can follow this completely. So that's a really interesting difference. So just to give you sort of now the frame of reference that I have is like, what I'm trying to do through UTOK is build the exterior psychological scientific view. Okay. So like you have to be grounded in the behavioral position from the exterior to understand mental, so that you film something and say, hey, I understand this is what's happening from the outside. Okay. And then the challenge is to deal with the inner mind. All right. And then to deal with whatever waking consciousness and then whatever transcendent states are, whatever secondarily. The yogic science is essentially the exact inverse of that. It drops into what I would call mind two as waking consciousness from a perspective, and then utilizes meditation to expand it above and below.
Mm-hmm.
And then what he comes to is body, down into the body, and then into vital, which would be the biological existence. Okay. Then there's deep vital, like in your gut and your loins, feeding and fucking, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then you go up into heart, basically. I didn't always use that term, but essentially you move in and then, expand into normal human mentality. And then you're normally dealing with, God, I got to get money. I want to get laid. I want to do this work. I mean, that's what most people live in, right? And then the yogic tradition is about seeing that and then expanding past the egoic concerns of justifying why the self matters in its own particular real world. And then he expands into the various layers of mind, getting to overmind, which essentially is what the idea of the garden is. Okay, so the garden is the idea of, hey, we'd have a philosophy that would afford overmind. And then supermind is my iconic for that. Is just the elephant sun god, the ultimate divinity of goodness. You're Mount Sophia, whatever. So it's sort of be like, and so to watch him basically have this layering of back down to the energy, into matter, into the body, into vital mind, into justifying mind, and then for the expansive enlightenment and over and supermind. It's like, oh, it's like, oh, he went a different way and then expanded this, and I can now see that. That's really, to me, that's like I don't know. I felt very different reading it in that regard. It was fascinating to see the transformation. So I just figured I would share that with you as a, given that your transpersonal psychological history. I'm waking up, Bruce.
That's very cool. It seems like, you found it basically kind of like the mirror image of what you were doing, following the same track from a different side of the mountain in a way. So
totally. And that's exactly the whole hope here, is that there's an opportunity. I got trained in third person science empiricism. That's what my, in a hard nosed sort of way. Then I saw how broken and ineffectual that was, but I kept that as a sort of needed. But then I evolved into, and now I can see my old modernist view of that. It's like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. But it's unbelievably narrow in some ways and constricted, because it already determines that you can't look in terms of expanding waking consciousness, because you don't even know how to talk about it from a third person. Let me look at Watson did. He basically said, I'll pretend it doesn't even exist. I mean, it's absurd, But then now it's like, now that I grew out of that and then flipped over and sort of oriented toward wisdom, and then you expand the consciousness beyond trans-egoic functioning, and then have visions, and then experience oneness all the way back down to energy, and then feel the divine shining light of rays on that. I mean, and then realize that, and then he's like, well, is that nirvana, or is that Atman, or, and he bounces back and forth. And it's like, well, okay, yeah, we can be sort of agnostic about it. But the idea that our human soul is potentially oriented towards that seems now to be absolutely, I mean, we should have that's scientifically clear. That's what material science just doesn't even know how to talk about, yet alone discover.
Right. Yeah. I think I shared with you a rather esoteric Dzogchen text, and I'm imagining on first reading, it probably also is a bunch of opaque gobbledygook that's not grounded and doesn't have any clear referent, and it's like, I can't go past a few pages in this. I had that experience of sharing that same text with a philosophy of science professor who wondered how I walked into his class out of India and was acing all of his philosophy of science tests and questions, and none of the scientists were. And for me, I can see the connection, but for him, the language game was just far too different to really penetrate.
Totally. Totally.
But it's exciting that there is actually that degree of resonance and accord once you crack some of the language codes.
Right. That's right. And that's why I think our projects here, my project with John, your project that we bring over to Bart, and all this emerging project of sort of a post-integral metaphysical frame, that getting systems to talk to each other really is. And now if these things weave together and with this level of specificity and clarity, the ground will be built for a genuine transition, because the language systems will afford enough coherence and intelligibility and be so obviously superior to the broken, chaotic, fragmented pluralism of before. That's a big deal. That's essentially, to me, if the crucial piece of if we're going to live the back half of the century without a meaning mental health and environmental disastrous crisis, that's a required piece of the puzzle, and it's cool to see it potentially coming online.
Definitely. And that's a worthy horizon to be heading towards.
Amen, brother. Better. It's better than sitting in the bed in despair. So at least that's my justification for getting out. All right. So we have the human identity function. And so we talked about that. And then the Euler identity, Leonhard Euler is one of the great mathematicians of all time. It's 1748. He basically publishes this. There's questions of whether other people could have derived it before him. But anyway, this is called the Euler identity. It's E, which is this natural log constant, raised to I times pi. You'll see this in different orders. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's I first or pi first. Plus 1 equals 0. And that's the, I'm not going to say much more than that, other than say it is when people ask and look empirically, ask mathematicians, what's the most beautiful equation in mathematics? This is by far the one that wins the most votes, which is interesting. It gets some significant attention in culture. It shows up in The Simpsons, I think, 3 different times. And therefore, if it shows up in The Simpsons in 3 different times, there's a video, Mathologer video that, delineates this formula so that even Homer Simpson can understand it, or at least that's the goal. So there is a way to understand just basically what this means and how these things connect together. And I did not know, and this is an important point, I built the equivalency in 2001. And it's crucial to understand. Now, most people would say this as a total, the right initial interpretation, well, you're a fucking quack, you don't know what you're talking about. Because I'm trying to say, hey, I've got insights for physics and philosophy and math and things like that. But I was so ignorant in 2001, I had no idea what the Euler identity was. And it turns out that it has meaning. I discovered it in 2003 that it even existed. So that's yes, you could say, well, I'll turn off the video. I don't care about this guy anymore then if you didn't know what the Euler identity was. But it turns out that actually encountering the Euler identity based on what I did, it's also important to note that the Euler identity is a special case of the Euler formula. This is the Euler formula, e to the I, in this case, t, standing for time. It could be x, it could be any number of variables, equals cosine of t plus I sine of t. And when the pi, et equals pi, if t were to equal pi, then you get e equals -1 because cosine of pi is -1, and then you get the other thing factors out, and then you get, so e to the pi I equals -1, or e to the pi I plus 1 equals 0. So it's a special case of the Euler formula. And that's, and like I said, I didn't know anything about those things when I encountered the Euler identity, but it's worth noting that this equation is seen by many as unbelievably important. The Euler formula is used in quantum mechanics a lot. Richard Feynman called it one of the most remarkable, almost astounding formulas of all mathematics, because it grounds a path called phase vectors, essentially uses the Euler identity, and well, really the Euler formula, to measure the way in which the interaction between the operators that are looking at events influence the events. And that's kind of what you see in this picture. Sort of on the outside, you have an operator that creates a particular context to observe the input-output processes of a field. And the Euler formula affords a mathematical articulation for how to get the probability wave of the intersection of the measurement with the event. And that's really the embedded mathematics of, or at least that's a path to mathematical analyses of quantum mechanics, and the intersection between measurement and event is achieved through the Euler formula. So that's the third kind of piece of awareness and sort of at least background. The final fourth piece is this thing called the equivalency. And the equivalency is this 2 pi I f thing. And I arrived at this formula in 2001. And like I said, I didn't have any idea about the Euler identity or anything else. And it relates to the way the tree of knowledge system frames the relationship between human mathematical physical observer knowers and the real physical behaviors in the universe. That's what it does. And the equivalency is not meant as a traditional mathematical equation. Okay? That is, it's not supposed to say, oh, you can now take these variables and then go and apply them in a particular way. It's a specific meaning in a specific context. And particularly what it really represents is a metaphysical representation that forms a doorway that links many different forms of thought together. Mathematics, human subjectivity, third-person empiricism, quantum mechanics, and radiation. Those are basically especially. And what that affords then is a particular associative network of equivalency. when I saw this, basically the short story, and this one we won't go any further in this particular presentation, essentially the punchline is that when I developed the 2 pi IF, what it meant to me was this is a symbol of the mathematical operations, okay, that physicists have built to create equivalencies between observer-observed relations. That is essentially what it's supposed to mean. So I essentially hypothesized that. So the meaning of the equivalency is, I actually figured out a way, or at least through the tree of knowledge, looking at physics and knowers through the tree of knowledge, I basically factored out in the empirical world. And after I'd factored out the empirical world, I left behind these mathematical representations. And then what's interesting is that this mathematical representation essentially predicts, well, these should be the kind of mathematical operators that should undergird physics. And then the cool thing was I stumbled across the Euler Identity or Euler Formula and was like, oh, that is exactly right. I basically intuited the existence of the Euler Identity and Formula through this process. And that is exciting from the vantage point of at least my worldview, is that sort of creates a particular opportunity.
Yeah, that is exciting. And, I understand when we talked before, you said some physicists, gave you some resistance to this framing. But yeah, I'm thinking of Wilbur's calculus, which to me doesn't have the same level actually of sophistication of what you're talking about here. But he developed what he called a calculus. And of course, mathematicians were pretty quick to respond that what he developed doesn't function like a calculus at all. It is a notational, kind of a metaphysical, math-like notational system to capture complex ideas in a compact form.
Exactly.
And I think you've done that also, but I think there's a very suggestive relationship to an actual, very profound mathematical formula. So I think that's encouraging, even if, the way you framed it didn't land in, strictly in the mathematicians,
Totally.
physicists and mathematicians circle.
Yep.
I think it captured an insight that maybe was an application of the Euler identity outside of its typical field of application.
Totally.
Right?
I appreciate that. I deeply appreciate that. And ultimately, because I am a psychologist and because I am, what I'm trying to do here is create bridging. I actually, at the end of this whole thing, I actually talk about the various interpretations, and one I call the anti-equivalency interpretation. The anti-equivalency is, this is fucking bullshit. I mean, the things don't work. It doesn't commute. It's not traditional math. Enriquez is trying to make a connection between one of the greatest mathematicians of all time through this equivalency. He doesn't even fucking speak math. It's absurd, and it should be rejected strongly. Okay. So that's what I call the anti-equivalency justification. And it's right. There is a way in which that from traditional mathematical structures and systems of justification, that's actually correct. Okay. And that should be appreciated. That's not like something I'm defending against. And it's the case that 150 slides later, after all 3 presentations, my argument would be, I just walk somebody through a network of association between so many different concepts that aligns their proper relation that it is damn fucking impressive. And that you then have to say, well, all of the associations that I just walked you all through are meaningless. And by the way, I'm saying right up front that this isn't a traditional mathematical language. So you're applying a particular criteria from an institutional language game that I immediately acknowledge to be not valid. That's not the proper interpretation. And what I basically argue is that there's a synthesis, but if we can figure out a way between the Henricus believes this is true and valuable, and the institution would say this is meaningless and bullshit, there's actually somewhere, I think, will be a synthesis in relationship to those two belief junctures that will afford deep insight. That's ultimately the conclusion, is that actually the knowledge of both the justification of why it's valid and we should invest in it and why we shouldn't affords a thesis antithesis potential synthesis that ultimately is shining the light that I want to shine the light towards. So it's definitely not something that we should be afraid of or defensive about or feel, yep, nope, and how the hell does what follow make any sense then? Or why is it valuable? So anyway, I'm definitely want to be clear that I appreciate that what would be a traditional critique. And this thing is, I knew this was right when I saw it at some level, and then it's driven me into cumulative knowledge jump after cumulative knowledge jump. So that gives me good, at least individual belief that my intuition was right. So what is actually represented? Well, if we do take 2 pi, that's a circle. We take f, that's 2 half circles in that regard. Then there's the imaginary dimension, and it's orthogonal to the real dimension, so it creates this. So essentially, it's a circle and a frequency on an imaginary and real dimension. Why does that equal 1? I initially developed my justifications for why that equaled 1, okay? But ultimately, this is a mathematical representation of the Euler formula, and the Euler formula, e pi I plus 1 equals 0. And one of the things that the early mathematicians told me as being nonsensical is that I had a time dimension in here. This is actually frequency of oscillation per second. That's where the F is. That's what it comes from. I'm not going to get into where it comes from, but it's the frequency of oscillation per second on one side of the equation versus 1 on the other side of the equation. So originally the mathematicians immediately looked at it and said, well, you have a unit, a time unit on one side of the equation and no time unit on the other side of the equation. Okay. So you're wrong. You can't. Well, then I found the Euler identity. Well, this is a particular, this is the Euler identity representation, or a reasonable Euler identity interpretation. Okay. And what that means, look, it's the exact same. Well, this is a spiral here, which actually is an interesting thing. But this graphic and this graphic, and so that I found an idealized proof, okay, that has what many people afford the opportunity to create a circling time dimension within it. Well, okay. Well, if it, that was one of the things that I used to say, yes, I knew that any normal mathematician would call that stupid, but I know that I'm seeing something. Well, lo and behold, here's a perfect proof that has an intuitive time dimension, depending on how you define time or cyclical process. So that was one of the cool things that, and then ultimately then, okay, there's the parallel. The basic trail of thought starts with this thing called the equivalency, okay? It then finds its way into the Euler identity. And then it's like, oh my gosh, when I learned about, as soon as I saw it, what happened, my wife brought home this book called Where Mathematics Comes From by Lakoff and Nunez. It's a fascinating book. The last 100 pages are an application of their ideas. It's their cognitive science and mathematician. And it's essentially how the human mind generates mathematical things. And then they do an idea analysis, mathematical idea analysis on the Euler identity. And it shows the history of concepts of algebraic, well, first addition concepts and line concepts and geometric concepts, and then change concepts, and then all of these concepts over time that got juxtaposed together to create a network, what John would call a mathematical psychotechnology, and then as I trailed, I was like, oh, those are exactly the conceptual operators that I was intuiting as being present if we factored everything, if we factored out the human knower as an entity, scientists knowing about like photons, you factor that out, you're left with logical identity relations. That's the whole idea. And at some level, that's commonsensical, but the way I got there was inverted from many other places. So to get there through a totally different line. So that was the original merger. And ultimately that gives rise to then my intuition was to then substitute, and I didn't really understand this relation, but I was like, well, if this equals 1 and that equals 1, I can substitute. And then this affords me what I call the radical mathematical humanistic equation. And I basically arrived at that was when I realized that I could take the mathematician's critique, and basically that makes no sense, and agree with it, but put adjacent to it, well, how can I see all this other stuff anyway? And now can we create a synthesis across the rejection of it as keep it away, to actually know it's a pathway into something good. And that's what, I called it a radical mathematical humanistic equation because it was sort of like a fuzzy logic of adjacency. It's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. And look at this, it's like, you can't just dismiss on the grounds of pure mathematical language, sure, but this is a radical mathematical humanistic equation, and so I use that. And then in 2017, ultimately, I built what gave the iQuad path. And the iQuad path fundamentally is what ultimately gives rise to the iQuad formulation. And that was this idea that I made some linkages, afforded me my subjective justifying space with this thing as making the connection between 2 pi I f equals 1, okay? And then backed up and said, well, if I afford the idea that I quad equals 1, okay, and that's, again, I'd have to explain some of the leakages that I made, I could then draw a line, a radical mathematical humanistic line of continuum across identities that then afforded a very, very powerful matrix of understanding. That was and so essentially then you get this equivalency and then the emergence of the iQuad, okay, as a coin that then represents subjective fields on the one hand, okay, and mathematical fields on the other. All right, it's because all of a sudden it was like, well, I could put together where and factor out where was the subjective idiographic, and at the same time, kind of like Henrique's Cartesian coordinates, it was also like, well, no, there's also a mathematical relation in here too that's entangled, okay, and that's what the iQuad coin ultimately affords, is an entanglement between this mathematical unit circle and the human identity. And it's that entanglement then, and ultimately then what you get is you get this identity equivalency frame. The identity equivalency frame starts with, well, you have this, that's what I'll be diving into some today, is this human identity equivalency. It's like, oh, here's the human identification matrix and the unit circle, and I'm going to entangle those into a weird adjacency. There is the Euler identity, okay, which we can say, hey, it's Euler, and he's a great mathematician. One of the greatest things that he did was this thing. So here he is, his subjectivity generating this, okay, and the formula, which is on the bottom. This graph then creates, this is a unit circle with the Euler identity placed on top of it, okay, and that's what the Euler identity is. It's a version of the unit circle with the natural logarithmic algorithmic change function placed in it. And so this is that's just an interesting mathematical representation. So now all you have here is just an interesting association between this human identity function, represented as a coin, and standard strict mathematical beauty. Okay. And there's nothing to really debate there. It's basically, oh, I'm making an association. Here's a cool matrix. And then the kicker is the affordance of pulling this equivalency, my equivalency that I generated, and I generated this equivalency through the way the tree of knowledge places human scientific knowers on a evolutionary complexification grid that starts with Big Bang and goes from the physical energy to the material, living, mental, cultural. And that's where I got that from. So now what you have is you have the human identity, the Euler identity, the equivalency, which is connecting to the formula and this frame. And it is this synthesis, ultimately, it's the synthesis of these parts that I believe gives rise to a descriptive metaphysics that would afford a unified mathematical, physical, material, mental, cultural, empirical field theory. And if we get that, yeah, that's a good weekend's worth. Well, you get a gold star for the weekend if you pull that off over the weekend. So that's the basic, architecture of the whole system. And I decided I'd try to, upfront that because I didn't do that with John because I had to get into a lot. But since you had some of the background and stuff, I wanted to start there and see if you have any reactions to that. And then I'll do a little bit dialogue on the human identity function.
I have one intuitive thing coming up that I'm shy to mention.
Okay.
One, because I really am fairly mathematically illiterate, though I do appreciate that book by Lakoff and Nunez. That's quite an interesting book, and I like their philosophy in the flesh and what they're doing. What's in my mind, and I don't know mathematically the full implications of the Euler identity, but I'm thinking of something like Kitaro Nishida's concept of contradictory identity.
Okay.
And it is a kind of like intense, it's an adjacency model where there's this intensification of the bringing together of total opposites. And I see your coin as a kind of representation of basically of the 0 and the 1, of the field and the point of
Totally.
yeah.
It's
So
beautiful.
I'm sensing that and thinking that maybe Nishida has some language and some framings that are interesting for unpacking some elements of what you're talking about that at least would register in my brain that has training more in the Zen and the Buddhist and other kinds of things. But
that's a beautiful association. Beautiful.
Okay.
I mean, it's great. I need to learn more about that. I don't know enough about that. But the ultimate frame of the equivalency, okay, is a special case of an observer identifying what I call a single frequency photon. Okay, a single frequency photon just has one loop in it. All right. That one loop can be measured from kinetic energy perspective, as the Planck-Einstein relation is called, E equals hf. Okay. And then what I discovered is that there's the Born-Heisenberg-Jordan matrix mechanics equation, which is PQ minus QP equals H over 2 pi I times the identity matrix. Anyway, in the special case of the single frequency photon, the measured information is aligned and equivalent with the kinetic energy. Okay. So you have kinetic behavior and measured behavior create an identity. And what that means is then it's the identity of the measured observing knower. So a human knower all the way up top as a subjective field of this piece of information. And on the flip side, it's an identification with the ontic kinetic energy that you never actually see, but you see through information. Okay. But this is a special case where the actual kinetic energy equals the information measured. So that's the uniqueness of the identity. So you normally are just, and normal physics, classical physics was, you could always observe shit without influencing. There would always be, you never had to entangle the observer. You could always get the observer out of the equation. And of course, we learned in quantum mechanics that's not the case. What this says is actually where the observer becomes the energy. There is a special case at the smallest action unit, at the quantum, Planck's constant. And it's in the formulas, and you just drop it down. It's like, and the physicists, when they show them, it's like, what does that mean? It's like, well, from my vantage point, that means that I made an identification between the human observer equivalent to the simplest thing in the universe, the photon, a single frequency photon. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of, making identities between contradictory entities, that are making equivalencies between contradictory entities. What's more contradictory at some level? We're the most complex thing in the universe. Well, sorry from all the other things that are more complex, but I'll leave that for. But if we're the most complex observers, this is a special case of that contradictory identity coming together on two sides of a coin. So that's why I would say, that intuition. I'm glad that came sparkled up. I need to learn more about that frame.
Good. I think that, there's this, it's also something that I think began to sparkle up in Bhaskar's work and made him take a few associational steps that led some of his colleagues to think he had jumped the shark.
Right.
But that's where his logic led him, was to this kind of non-duality of observer observed. That really opened him up to a whole wider wisdom sphere and what he began to unpack as meta-reality instead of just his critical realism.
Totally.
Was following the logic totally implicit within the critical realism.
Right. I see Bhaskar like falling in a tunnel and I'm like right behind him. It's like I tipped into the tunnel also. I'm getting that.
Yeah.
No, it's exactly. And that's what it fundamentally it is also. And the other thing that's interesting about the equivalency is that I believe that underneath matter, we can think about, and physics basically teaches this, underneath it all, the best way to describe the ontic is an energy information field. And quantum field theory and Big Bang singularity stuff, super force, everything collapses into a particular bosonic energy force. Both of those points are underneath matter, there's an energy information field. And then we're creating a non-dual observer-observed equivalency. I'm an energy information field, and that's an energy information field, and we're having contact at the right singular level. And then when you have that one is many, many, one, fusion, then you're like, oh, then the ego breaks and you go beneath and you go pre and post trans justificatory. And then you have the wisdom meta reality awakening.
Right. Beautiful, man.
That's what we need, man. We need the wisdom meta reality awakening, Bruce. Now the question is how, that I don't know. But anyway, that's it. So, all right, a few more. We're obviously not going to get super far into this because I just, it's so fun talking with you. We get stuck in all this other stuff. It's beautiful. So anyway, so that's the basic part that I wanted to share. Okay. So the other thing that I want to talk a little bit about is what I went over with John, at least I'm going to shift gears a little bit. And then basically like, okay, let's sit with this human identity function at a relatively common sense level. Because the argument is that we can enrich the field at the level of human identity function, and then we can enrich the field then down the road into physics, and then return back to, say, meta-reality wisdom. And it is that juxtaposed in a relation. So we have to situate the field in terms of the human identity function. The overarching picture then is the UTOK picture is the tree, the coin. And this, by the way, is 2 pi IF symbol, this little black circle with the frequency. It's going to connect the frequency of observed behavior with observer, and I create equivalency there. And I'm going to do that through what I call the rotation. The rotation on the coin is that creating that identity matrix so that observer, observed are and then placed in the agent arena identity matrix relation. And then that's going to go all down to physics and in a particular way, making consonant phenomenology in physics, or at least that's the goal. And then from there you get my thing's not working super well, the flip into ought. Okay, so you rotate and flip, you flip the coin, and then so you identify with right relationship with what it is, and then you metabolize that into right relationship with what ought to be. And then and that's the wisdom energy relation. So that the flip into ought is the picture of the garden underneath the elephant sun god. The elephant sun god's the ultimate irony, which we can just pull from divinity. I certainly can't experience supermind. I can experience some, if we use the greater good, I have felt overmind, and I felt the light from supermind. I don't know what that is, first person. That's where my level of ego development is. But I can feel the light coming off of it. We'll put it that way. I think this affords a particular kind of way to frame is ought, and a way to frame science, the subjective human knower, and wisdom. So in terms of the place and meaning of the coin, then, the first thing is that it symbolizes this human identity function. And at the same time, this gets into the argument about philosophy of science. It's a placeholder for the unique subjective knower, which is fundamentally absent or blind in natural behavioral science language systems. And then the goal of the coin, if to then sort of deepen that, is to orient the subject toward primate and person modes of being and knowing. It symbolizes the humanity dialectic, symbolizes the unity multiplicity dialectic, and then represents part of the solution to the digital identity problem. And so these are all of the various, that's the goal now of sort of like, okay, what I'm trying to do here in this basic thing is I'm trying to, locate it, the coin, say, in relationship to John's point about the meaning crisis. Okay, so it's like, there's a coin in relationship to who I am, and then I want to create a clear set of fields that afford ease of communication with, that's how I make sense out of my, I have perceptions in the world, I have actions in the world, I have desires, I have beliefs and propositional thoughts. That makes good sense. And then it's the sort of the larger world of the context that we find ourselves in, and then how to connect my subjective idiographic with those larger things in a way that affords positive opportunity. So I'm going to we'll be pretty quick on this because we just spent time on this. So this is the human identity function, describes a descriptive metaphysical frame for both physical material, mental, living, mental, and then ethical space. And then here's the rotation and flip in relationship to the garden. So the H, human, and then rotate to identity. Okay, that rotation is going to actually, one way to think about that is that gets you to the left side, is going to orient your human identity function and then place it in relationship to the situation we find ourselves in, both socially and say physically relative to the universe. And then flip it, which is then say, okay, I want right wise relation to is and ought. So the rotation orients towards is, I rotate and create an identity matrix of what is, and then I flip to then be oriented to what ought to be. And creating an aspirational identity between, John would call it sort of your liminal, imaginal space, essentially. It's sort of like, what's the potential of being and becoming that I might afford in the future?
You know,
yeah, go ahead.
That little paragraph is so rich with information. Could you just pause on this paragraph about the frequency? Absolutely. And yeah, give an example or really just, unpack some of that a little bit?
Absolutely. Okay, so the frequency of the rotation and the flip of the coin creates a positional alignment and then aspirational identity between the experiencing subject, first in the physical world, and then in relationship to wisdom. Okay, so what do I mean? So now the rotation is, hey, I want to help here. Here's a way to download an operating system and put on your glasses and rotate them to afford you an opportunity to see the world through a particular lens. Okay. And the lens that I'm going to then afford is first your common sense view of yourself. Okay. So you're a named person and go around and solve problems and have problems, right? And have desires and beliefs and perform actions. And so that's your normal state, and it will relate to you in your normal state. And then it will try to afford a lens to see the world scientifically through what is, and to create a field of right relation of what is scientifically and is subjectively. That's the rotation. One way to think about this in terms of iQuad is to say, hey, okay, here's a unit circle sort of mathematically, I to the fourth. I'm going to then sort of, okay, I'll invite myself to connect to the tree of knowledge, and then I'll see the world as energy and matter and life and mind and culture. So that then is a lens, like, oh, I'm a culture person. My dog Benji is a mental creature. My plant is a living creature, and the earth, well, the earth's complicated. The moon is a rock and a material creature. And then the universe begins as an energy singularity. Okay, so that would be 4 dimensions of complexity on top of an energy. We should, according to the tree of knowledge, everyone, or it invites basically everybody to just have, that should be our walking around metaphysical map of complexification. And then the argument is well, given that reality, what is the meta-wise vision that we would want to afford, and how might we then be with what is, and to be effectively oriented to what ought to be? And the garden underneath the elephant sun god is the icons for wisdom, basically. And that is reflecting on values in a Sophia sort of way, meaning a love of wisdom and deep intellectual knowledge into wisdom thought, and embodying that in terms of phronesis. In fact, there are 2 little B's here. One is basically a phronesis B, this little wick W B. This is, hey, be a good character and do good things in the world in the embodiment of being. And this is sort of the Sophia B, the wicked wisdom B is like, it symbolizes, oh, how do we build good knowledge systems that are ethically grounded, that are accurate, that are sensitive, etc. So it's knowledge and wisdom. So that is the goal, and that can get symbolized with the aligning with the frequency of what is, and it goes all the way down to the frequencies of photons. It creates this deep identity net between me as a subjective knower, knowing about science, and the frequency of a single frequency photon creates a energy information net there to see what is, and then afford the flip into what ought to be. And that rotation flip function is a way to capture the is, ought, self, world, future relation. So, and so then the extension of this is the first thing is, yeah, it just represents. So one way to capture the representation is put a person's picture on there. And so, my version, Bruce's version, your version, who's ever listening, your particular, I often refer to yourself as your epistemological portal. It means your unique way of knowing about the world. And weird thing about consciousness is we basically get one portal. And at least at a perspectival level, we're sort of locked into it and really can't see anybody else's portal, but that's all another. But the Enlightenment split the first person subjective qualitative experience of being from the third person objective measurement. And this split of empiricism, I think, is underappreciated, that we should be, certainly people talk about it, but the profundity of the split between third person behavioral empiricism and first person phenomenological empiricism, and the difficulty in creating a metaphysics that reconciles those is one of the great challenges. I call this, or an aspect of this, this is an aspect of the Enlightenment gap. And the UTOK tries to bridge this. So, I'm not going to spend too much time on the Enlightenment gap. We've talked about that. But if you have any questions, essentially it's this argument that, hey, we had in some ways better holistic versions of models of mind with the pre-Socratic and Socratic philosophers, especially Plato gives an interesting model of the way the mind works that I certainly use today in terms of appetitive, emotional, logical. I even reference that, and ultimately spiritual mind. Aristotle's frame for the vegetative, sensitive, and rational souls correspond very closely to life, mind, and culture on the tree of knowledge. And tree of knowledge just adds core joint points to the evolutionary synthesis, behavioral investment theory, and justification systems theory to frame that and sort of update it. And we lost basically Aristotle's metaphysics. And we did that because Galileo rightfully criticized some of the scholastic metaphysical excesses that were happening at the time, and they weren't grounded in particular ways. And he also, his weird relationship with the church, but ultimately sets the stage for removing formal and final causes, leaving behind the efficient and material causes. And in so doing, and Galileo and Newton were both very clear on this, we're not really talking about mind. Maybe Descartes' right, maybe others are right, but they knew they were talking about classic matter in motion. The evolution of life, mind, culture, types of stuff were seen as a different kind of problem. But the physical sciences got dominant and they got very powerful. And of course, there was a fundamental shift in worldview and the need for empirical science, first with Copernicus into Galileo, who was really the father of modern science. And then, of course, we get Newton, laws of motion. It fundamentally changed the game. And the matter and motion classical mechanical universe, deterministic and reductionistic, becomes increasingly powerful for the hard-nosed ways to understand the world. We get Descartes dividing mind and matter into two different substantial worlds. And then that becomes the part of the Enlightenment gap that says, well, what is the proper relationship between mind and matter? And we never are able to put this together. We get the empiricists, primary versus secondary quality distinction. Primary are things that exist in the world. Secondary is the experience that we have of them. So you see sort of an initial break here. This would be primary would be more third person empiricism, and secondary is first person empiricism. Finally, we get Immanuel, well, not finally, but in terms of really what I think would happen to a psychology, at least, we get Immanuel Kant, and he synthesizes and gives rise to the phenomenological, epistemological view of the categories of mind. The human mind generates a particular phenomenological structure. But ultimately, what we then are handed down, in my estimation, is a Newtonian materialistic ontology. The world's physical out there. And a Kantian epistemology, human creates phenomenological categories of mind to know about it. The Kantian epistemology evolves into the scientific epistemological method, and we basically have scientific materialism. But inside of that, there is no proper metaphysical system for helping understand human subjectivity, how it emerges, evolves out of the world, and how it functions to map back onto the physical world in proper relation. So in the tree of knowledge, relative to the coin, provides ultimately a frame that then also allows us to orient towards a wise meta reality. I want to keep using Bhaskar. And that's the flip. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and I can feel my little, it's probably good for me to bring this to a little bit of a close in terms of my own space from yesterday. Feeling a little tense in the backside here. Because I had a little flare up yesterday. So let's bring this to a close. And I really appreciate, I know it's maybe a little abrupt, but I think that would be helpful in terms of, we covered a lot of ground in some ways that I didn't cover. What I'd like to do though, is before we do that, is just to sort of get your flavor, reflections about what you're seeing as this thing unfolds. And what from an, I'm so deep in this, I'm having a hard time sometimes seeing like, well, what's the proper zone of proximal development for other people? Like John had a really nice thing framing. He was like, oh, two things he said. One was like, hey, you probably need a manual, okay, like how to interpret this that's properly developmentally situated. And maybe one day to get that you're after is like this, a talisman of transformation. He framed it as. It was like, oh, that resonated. So basically my question for you is, I deeply appreciate your comment about sort of contradicting identities, your integral post-metaphysical frames on prepositions, Layman's adjacency metaphysics is salient. What thoughts do you have, if any, in relationship to this emerging psychotechnology, and what would be the best questions you have, or ideas or brainstorms for what to do with it?
There are a couple things that are on my mind from that, last portion of your presentation. Try to pull them together in a clear way. One of which is, you could say, Kant's own kind of Copernican revolution,
yep,
where he showed, that what we see, Copernicus showed that, what we observe out in the world is in part due to the condition of the observer.
Yep.
And Kant did that, saying that what we observe, in a sense, is the product of the pre-existing categories, structures, filters of the human mind. So we perceive the world as ordered by human consciousness.
Yep.
But he presupposed that there were some constants in terms of human categories and filters that subsequently we have discovered are not really as constant as he presupposed. And that's the whole kind of postmodern turn, where it brings us into a bit more of a floaty and soupy relativism, because now we have subjectively mediated phenomena, but not a kind of grounding. Yes. And I think Bhaskar was wanting to wrestle with and address that lack of groundedness.
Totally.
And which
I think he did brilliantly, by the way. I love his epistemic fallacy analysis of Kant. It really is. It was striking and moving, and moved me forward in my thinking about ontology and epistemology in proper relation, as opposed to I was vulnerable sort of having this Kant Newtonian split in my head, and Bhaskar builds bridges with critical realism in deep ways. So I'll just make it, that's just a side commentary that I know, but for people that are listening who may not.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think Bhaskar needs to be much more widely digested. It's unfortunate that he is as difficult to read as, some other people who have a lot to say. But in terms of the aligning with the frequency and the flip that is afforded by that, as I'm understanding what you're laying out there, is that the alignment with what is facilitated by certain kinds of metaphysical framings that, like the tree of knowledge and the larger model that you're building, that can facilitate a deeper perception of what is, which then can afford a the move towards the ought, the move towards wisdom from a deeper alignment with what is.
Beautiful.
And Hume, of course, said you can't get from the is to the ought, right? Bhaskar has challenged that, and knowing the position of a photon, doesn't really tell you anything about what to do. It doesn't have any moral impact in that regard. But Bhaskar argued, at least at the social domain and higher, the right kind of perception of what is, which can help you cut through, the basically false consciousness and demi-reality. That can help you then move towards the ought through the clear perception of the distortions in the social field, for instance. So what I'm picking up on, and I'd like to know if I'm missing something or if that's clear, is that what you're presenting is, through your model, a way of getting clear on what is that can kind of cut through some of the social distortions in psychology, in the wake of the Enlightenment turn, things like that. That once we can clarify that, will then make the path of going forward and towards wisdom and greater coherence of vision possible.
Beautiful. That's exactly. Thank you. That's a wonderful summary and exactly what I'm after. I'll give a couple of examples. So I love the Bhaskar connection. That's exactly right. So to bring it back to Sri Aurobindo, for example. Okay. So I would argue at a logos level, the realization that I am an energy information field and so is that photon as an is level. That affords a particular kind of expansion of oneness that's interesting and important. And I think it's interesting and important in relationships of some of the misconceptions that we have been given from the Enlightenment understanding of what science says about man, to use that intentionally. So for example, Barry Schwartz gave a great articulation of what's called the battle for human nature. In a book called The Battle for Human Nature, and basically said, hey, economic man and evolutionary selfish gene framing and behavioral man, all of them basically present an instrumental, rational, self-interested creature, okay? It's driven by hedonism, driven by genes, driven by cost-benefit analysis for the rational self-interest of the being. I don't think that's an accurate scientific view of what is at all to be the case. One of the points that I highlighted on a number of things, you may have heard this, but I'll just say it again, is I initially sort of had that frame, and it's indicative of like what's the influence matrix, social influence. Social influence is a pragmatic, instrumental, when you think about it as a resource, how much can I move other people in accordance with my interests? So it's pragmatic, influential. After all, that's what actually puts food on the table, gets you mates, gets you good position and status, and that's fair. But at the same time, I realized clinically, oh my God, many people have social influence, but they feel like imposters. They're around people they don't value. They don't feel known and valued, and they're miserable in that regard. Okay, we get taught to use now shift that over to like John Vervaeke and interpretation of Fromm. We don't have our instrumental capital, productivity domain is just shining us a light on competitive acquisition of consumer production modes of being, having and doing. Okay. They don't afford us clarity with deep authenticity about being and becoming modes. Those are weakly acknowledged. And then either, well, you just make it up because we know what science tells us is real, but it's, you can bullshit yourself. We get just massive weak tea. That's just wrong. That is not the right way to see the human condition. It's not hyper self-centered. It's not totally focused on hedonism. Anybody that would work really hard to climb to the top of Mount Everest can tell you it's not about hedonism. There are a lot of other motives that drive people in relation. And so I think we have discovered a huge amount that afford us the opportunity to get right relation of energy, matter, life, mind, culture, and see ourselves as justifying apes who may be able to find right relation with something higher. And that is the accurate isness. And then in relationship to ought, and the last thing I'll say is I used to have a saying about this whole is ought thing. I was like, can, i.e. what can be, exists between is and ought. Okay. So the idea that there's yes, I agree with Hume that you cannot derive from is to ought in a formal deductive or inductive logical line. Fair enough. But to say that they're not related is absurd. I mean, that's ridiculous. Every individual is an investment valuing, justifying, influencing creature who is soaked in value. That's all what we do. It's mediated by our own value. And what is the case relative to what ought to be the case sets the stage for well, that in between is what can we do? And so right relation with what is crucial to how we think about what we can be. And that's the other point, is that the Enlightenment screwed us over. And no pointing fingers, but the meta reality and the greater psychology that's appointed to by Surya Aurobindo into Wilbur and into Roy Bhaskar, without any ontological claims, that's absolute. From my vantage point as a natural scientist now on this side of there's just no doubt that is that's the actual is, not some fluffy frame of reference. I mean, we can get into ultimate spiritualities, that's debatable, but to the potential of what feeds the human soul, and that there is a first person soul relative that is seeking to be valued and have purpose and meaning, the data are crystal clear that that's right. That's what it is. It seeks larger meaning. That's how nature built us. So we better get right relation with what science tells us. And we need to do it actually fast. Because look around. If we have an appreciation for the human identity matrix that we're actually in, it's good news ultimately, because it tells us it's a very hopeful message that speaks much more to, I think, the human soul experience in a way that demonstrates that the human soul experience is pointing something with value, and we can get right relation with what it is, and then we will be much better suited to orient to what ought to be with consequences on the back half of this century.
Beautifully put. Yeah, that's great.
So
yeah, I sense the echoes there with our own concerns in the Sacred Naturalism series.
Right,
about
totally.
exploring. Basically, it's really a naturalistic, humanistic, and broader concern to get into right relationship with as much clarity as possible with what we know about the world and its patterns and its trends and its potentials.
Exactly. All right. Beautiful. Yes, and it's a wonderful plug in and tie in to our sacred naturalism conversations, which I've deeply enjoyed. And that's right. This is it's a token of sacred naturalism. You can frame it in that regard. So maybe we'll ultimately circle back into that conversation and do so. All righty, friend. Well, any other final thoughts as we wrap it up here?
No, I just really enjoyed, taking the journey with you. It really makes me regret my own lack of math skills, but beyond that, I think I grokked enough to appreciate your project, and actually hope to take that step into the part 2 of this journey and unfolding.
Great. My son's a math major. Okay. So if I glance over his shoulder on whatever he's working on, I'm instantaneously shamed, and he'll immediately turn, God, you don't even know what an integral is. So it's like, so it is, I am hiding, and I'm coming out with some of the stuff. So I want to be very clear. I empathize with all of that, and I don't have any genuine I know about these concepts some, I don't know them deeply, but I have an angle on them that perhaps affords a different kind of clarity from a different adjacency, and that might open up some possibilities. We'll see.
Right.
All righty, friend. Thank you so much for joining me. Deeply appreciate it. This on special iQuad edition with Bruce. Thank you.
Wonderful.